Hello to everyone. Today we have Fiona Ramage. Am I pronouncing right?
Yep.
Okay, great. From the University of Dundee. She's a PhD student and she's doing a very interesting work from my point of view, because she's not doing a classical research bench work related or a clinical research, but actually she's doing a more systematic review. And well, you can tell us in general the topic of your project, and since then we can see the main observation of this work.
Yeah, no problem. I'll do that. So I started my PhD in 2017 in neuroscience, and I studied the effects of high-fat diets on cognition, kind of the links to like dementia, diabetes, and how unhealthy diets kind of do impact your cognition. I started off doing rodent lab work, and it was going okay, but for personal reasons, I decided to switch directions for my project, and I started reading the literature, trying to figure out next steps. And what I noticed is that I found it very, very hard to synthesize my field. I found it hard to realize what the knowledge gaps were, and I found it really hard to know what we knew, what we didn't know about the field, and sort of which direction I could possibly head in for these experiments. So then the idea came to me to try and do a systematic review, which, as I will talk about in a bit, is still not that common to do in preclinical or in vitro research, and it's more something that everyone will have come across in like randomized control trials in patients. But yeah, I started doing a preclinical systematic review, trying to answer the same research question: what are the effects of high-fat diets on cognition? And also, what are the mechanisms behind these effects? How do high-fat diets affect the brain exactly? Like what molecular and metabolic mechanisms are there?
Okay. Thank you very much for telling in general the topic and your approach, how you arrived to this approach of research. I was intrigued by the fact that you were doing a systematic review. It's something that recently I'm starting to hear about within the context of the science journals. So I'm starting to see this difference between the meta-analysis, systematic reviews, the narrative reviews. First, I would like to ask you in general, which are maybe the main observations of your approach, and maybe from there why different kind of reviews can be useful to know some more about a certain field, and which is the difference maybe more precisely among them. First, the main observations, please.
So you mean the main observations
of your work? Basically,
well, there's a few things that I've sort of come to realize. First of all, I've just having to design a systematic review and group all these different studies together and sort of compare them to one another and pull their information. I've realized just how different they are and how challenging it is to summarize something properly when they're, when preclinical research, every single experiment that you do is completely different from one another, and trying to bring them all together and analyze them as one whole is a challenge. But to me, it's a very interesting challenge, and I think that it has a lot of potential to actually show some differences. My results are incoming, so this is just me predicting things.
Of course.
That's going to be interesting. It might be a disaster, who knows? But
no.
The other thing that I've come to realize doing my research is that I found a lot of studies were maybe not designed a way I would have liked, and there were maybe some issues with them that to me make interpreting results more difficult. A common thing would be the use of randomization and blinding, which are important measures to reduce the risk of bias. The risk to reduce researchers carrying out the experiments of having their bias impacting how they view the results. And I've realized that a lot of papers don't use simple measures like this, even despite all the sort of positive the positive talk about them in recent years and people acknowledging how important they are. I've also come across very strange ways of designing experiments in terms of like which control groups are used, and I'm really interested to see what the results are in my field of whether the control diet that you choose or the control intervention you choose, like basically which control groups you choose for your experiments, whether that actually ends up impacting the results that we see that the researchers report.
But sorry if I interrupt you, but when you say sometimes the controls, let's say, are not the proper ones, or there is not maybe a standard way to pick the controls, you are talking about only clinical studies or also studies within that field, but touching also studies on animal models?
Yeah, no, yeah, I could have been clearer about that. So for me, first of all, I'm studying the effects of diet. So to us, it's very interesting which control diets are used. If you use a high-fat diet or, you know, just a generic unhealthy diet of some kind, and you compare it to a diet, you want to think which control diet do you use? And you could compare it to, for example, a very low-fat but high-sugar diet, but you also could compare it to a very standard rodent chow, which, you know, is very high in fiber, like almost like cereals, kind of grains. And just when you think about that, there's a difference between something that's essentially mostly sugar or something that's mostly these kind of complex carbohydrates would make a big difference. But quite often it's not really well reported, and it's not really clear which one researchers use. And to my knowledge, the impact of using one or the other has not been studied.
There is no precise information about, in particular, well, what you are looking at in terms of controls or, you know, way, the approach of how, you know, what is given as a food to controls. Making the point from all the studies, it's something very hard, but no, I'm just saying because also, you know, I come from a different field in terms that I worked with flies, and also within that topic, I have to say I always found slight differences in the way, for example, in particular, when we analyze behavior. I used to do behaviors because it also in that context that you feel can be a bit more standardized compared to humans. You see something different, a lot of differences. Okay, thank you. And it was another main aspect that you realized out of, you know, like of these that, you know, gave you this approach?
It's difficult because I'm really studying a lot of papers. I've read, you know, thousands, nearly maybe 10,000 abstracts, and I've read lots, maybe several hundred studies. So it's kind of hard to get an overall picture of them. But through the course of my PhD, I have really got good at focusing on like how an experiment is designed, and maybe I'm hoping I get a bit more of an eye of how to analyze it critically when I'm reading it and think like, is this saying what the authors are really claiming, or are there these places where they could have introduced some form of error, some kind of interpretation problems or something where they've not reported something clearly enough and the reader is just assuming things. So I like to think that I've become a lot better at approaching it critically, essentially.
Okay, so basically, out of curiosity, are you starting to have a kind of questionnaire template of questions that you try to address, or points that you, standard points that you try to address when you read the paper?
Kind of. I think we're sort of supposed to do that anyway. Like, you know, with I think that's one of the reasons. Like, I know that people who peer reviewers or editors also will use certain checklists, like sort of similar to like Arrive guideline type stuff. You know, that are really sort of key for like reporting certain measures. I don't have I have kind of those sorts of things in mind, those sort of general questions. And then there's some things that I have really become very kind of attuned to that bother me because I've come across them a lot, or because it maybe was a mistake that I did early on in my research myself. So for instance, there would be, you know, there's the issue of pseudo-replication.
Okay, yes.
things like that, where I'm trying to pay attention to it. And something else is like the use of statistics. I've got quite interested in that, and there's certain pretty common statistical, not really errors, but maybe sort of making claims that aren't really true based on the tests that you've done. And there's things like that that I consider that I've become very good at finding now, and that I maybe look for more than the average researcher.
Yeah. No, I totally get it. I have to say that for my role in the journal, I always check pseudo replication, statistical analysis. Yeah, and then at some point you pick some the missing information. Often there are missing information quite straight away at some point. Look, so when you talk about systematic review, I mean, what is a systematic review compared to, I don't know, how many reviews there are?
Yeah. So I'd like to point out before starting that I'm not an expert, and this is something that I switched into halfway through my PhD. I'm still learning. But yeah, to my knowledge, when we think of a literature review, the common ones that you might find that would give a good overview of your topic, so those are called narrative reviews. They're useful, and they provide often a pretty good summary that has the advantage of having the interpretations of an often experienced author, and it refers to lots of individual studies that you can then dig into and go and read. There are a few limitations to that kind of review, and that's where systematic reviews come in, where they can provide something that narrative reviews don't. The first thing would be in the title, which is the systematic nature, which is a narrative review. You can kind of pick and choose which papers you want to represent in your review. You can kind of think what kind of points you would like to emphasize, what kind of evidence you would like to show. Whereas in a systematic review, the aim is to come up with a research question and then design a comprehensive search strategy, which you will typically use in like three or more different databases online. And you will literally try and identify every single piece of evidence that exists that could help answer your research question. So you're casting a very, very wide net, and you're trying to identify absolutely everything that exists instead of just what you want to show. So that's a systematic approach to a systematic review. And then another approach that's important for systematic reviews is to reduce bias. I feel like I'm talking about bias a lot, but it's also possible to have bias of the person doing the review. So in systematic reviews, you would try and have two different people analyze, well, sort of deciding which studies to include, which studies do contribute to the research question, and you would also try and extract information from the papers side by side, two different reviewers with a third one resolving the differences. So you're really reducing the risk of any kind of bias from the person doing the review.
Okay. So basically, if I'm understanding right, let's say the narrative review or the literature review, the one that is basically the classical idea of a review that we have, it's basically, you talk about a topic, a specific topic, you give a certain angle, I suppose, and basically it's, like there is no much control besides, of course, in the moment that where the manuscript goes under peer review, how, biased, let's say, I've been, or about which angle I have considered. While basically it seems that a systematic review looks to me very super precise, almost a kind of an experiment, if I have to say, very, very specific. So as you said, at least I suppose three people at the end, two that basically do the same job in parallel, and the third one that basically makes the point. Am I right?
Yes, so it's not always the case. It's typically a sign of a good systematic review if that's done. It's something that you want your systematic review to have. You could do one yourself, and quite often in student projects and things like that you might work towards an undergraduate or bachelor's or master's or even a PhD thesis. You would quite often end up with just one reviewer. But typically a relatively good systematic review would have typically a small team working on it rather than just one person.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, I also want to point out something that I forgot to say is that systematic reviews will also typically differ in content quite a lot to narrative reviews, just when you come across one and read one. Because I think narrative review is more about obviously telling a story, whereas a systematic review seems to be, the ones I've come across is more about kind of collecting information and kind of comparing and contrasting studies in a less narrative way and in a more kind of typically you'd see things like collecting characteristics in tables and comparing them that way, that sort of thing.
Okay. But so you said before, just sorry, I get connected to another thing that you said before. So you have databases where you get like the sources from for the systematic review. Are there kind of databases that you can reference to? Am I right? You mentioned something like that, or maybe I misunderstood.
I mean, there are I may be using the wrong word, but there's a typical database would be like like NCBI PubMed, and you'd also have like Web of Science or Scopus or Embase and whatever. You just use several of those basically to just again cast this very wide net that you don't risk to have any kind of gaps in.
Okay. So I thought there was something else also to consider. And sorry, but and also when I have to say you did not mention a lot, but it came out from our the chat the other day. I was curious when you talk about instead meta-analysis. What you mean exactly? Compared to the systematic review.
So so a meta-analysis is something, as far as I know, it's not really done on its own. It's typically combined with a systematic review, and it's kind of taking a systematic review one step further. You can get a systematic review without a meta-analysis, but I don't view that as complete. What the meta-analysis does is, instead of just collecting study characteristics and kind of like describing the literature, what it also allows you to do is it allows you to look at things quantitatively. For example, if I'm looking at the effects of high-fat diet on cognition, I'm able to see to which extent high-fat diets affect cognition, like mathematically. I'm able to calculate what's called an effect size.
So it's an extra step of analysis that you perform on the data.
But it does get really interesting because you're able to see how that varies study to study. But then you're also able to do kind of like later sub-analysis. Instead of just having the one summary meta-analysis, you're also able to, for example, split things into groups, and you can see maybe there would be a greater effect in males than in females, or maybe you would see a greater effect in older animals than younger animals, or maybe, for example, in my case, maybe feeding animals a higher diets with a higher fat content might affect things more than animals fed a lower fat diet, for instance.
I see.
And so you can, it's just there's a million different kind of analyses you can do, and it really depends on what your research questions are. But it's really, instead of it's really trying to quantitatively analyze the impact of your study design choices, really. Instead of it just being a description, it's
Okay, thank you. I understood a bit more this world. But so, and basically now I'm talking in general in your study, you are looking at a bit let's say that the main question within different, again, models and humans, or you are focusing only, for example, on clinical studies?
So for me, it's a field that you could do lots of useful, like all of the things you suggested would be useful pieces of information to the field. I'm just focusing on preclinical work in mice and rats, one, because I had to narrow down my research question, and it's also what I happened to do for the lab portion of my PhD. So I would answer the same research question using the same method, well, just doing the exact same work but using a different method, really, as to what I was doing in the lab. So for me, that's mice and rats. But you'd be able to apply this method to any any sort of thing.
Yeah, I suppose. Okay, so basically you are focusing on the work
Yeah.
done on mouse and rats. Okay, and
yeah. And then it's also, so I will find out, hopefully, what exactly high-fat diets do to the brains of mice and rats. But then there will be the question of how much does this relate to what we see in humans? And that's something is probably going to be more guesswork and more sort of looking at the literature and discussing things rather than me having an answer, because it's all about what we call translatability, like how well do these findings translate from one species, from one model system to another? Like how much can you sort of extrapolate what actually happens in humans? And I don't know. So that's going to be a fun thing to discuss. But
okay.
yeah.
Yeah, no, for me, I have to say it's very interesting. I mean, consider that because also, again, since I come from working with fruit flies, so it's always something that, you have clear in mind that you can connect that information, with something that, of course, then is followed up, for example, in mammals and then in humans. So I like a lot, this approach that a bit makes the point and also very specifically connects the findings in the different, the species with, also in the humans. Okay, thank you very much. It was a very, very interesting thing because, again, this approach of writing and also doing a different research in a different way, basically, again, intrigued me a lot lately, and it was great that I could discuss with you that you have basically hands on it at the moment. So basically, we can say that there are also, also the PhD students can also consider, PhD students, researchers, this kind of different kind of approach to research that is not just doing the experiments, but also using whatever is already done and published to make the point. Because maybe, we publish a lot, we publish in terms of we publish a lot of results of experiments, but sometimes maybe I think also the scientific community misses the reality what we get, the main point, I think, of all these experiments.
Yeah, right. I think meta research, which is what I'm doing is called, it's not done that often, but it's definitely still very valuable as a discipline, and it's maybe something a bit different for maybe you're not very very fond of labs, or maybe you'd like to get into more computational or statistical sides of things. And if you're that kind of person, maybe a meta research project would be the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think, if I have to think really, of course, you should be interested in this kind of approach, but also practically speaking, maybe also in those, as you said, maybe you are not, you like the topic, but you're not super in love with the lab work, or sometimes you are in a lab that does not have a lot of fundings. I'm saying that because I am a bit divided. I did a bit of research, but as a student, I have to say, in Italy, and then later since my PhD in the UK. And I have to say, for example, in Italy, at least in the lab where I've been, there were not a lot of money. So sometimes maybe again, maybe it's not your case, I'm just saying, but practically, it can be also something that can be done, instead of doing experiments that are not very much informative, because sometimes I see the struggle to do experiments because there are not much funds. Maybe you can do a better, kind of this type of analysis that can be more informative, again, for you, for the scientific community, and does not require I think that fundings, that support, that I suppose. So just, I like always have to say to, again, since I did some different experiences, I like always a bit to also think about the practical, aspect sometimes of these different approaches. Okay. So I don't want to take much more of your time because you are in your last year of PhD. So we know that time is super precious in these months. So I thank you, Fiona. I thank also the audience. And if you have questions also that if you want, I can forward to Fiona. You can write in the comments. Yeah, we wish you a great week and productive. Okay, bye to everyone.